Ho Chi Minh was a Vietnamese communist leader who revolutionized communism in Vietnam.
During a news conference in 1954, Eisenhower explained the domino theory. The domino theory is when a country falls to communism and all the other countries around it fall to communism.
By 1957, the Viet Cong, an anti-communist group in South Vietnam, killed thousands of Vietnam communist officials.
Search and destroy missions were U.S. missions that we went into Vietnam, and it was where U.S. soldiers uprooted the Vietnamese citizens and burned their houses and took their livestock. There was a credibility gap during the Vietnam War. The Johnson administration would put out stuff that wasn't really true, and they would kind of like flaw it a little bit from what was actually happening over in Vietnam.
During the Vietnam War, the U.S. soldiers used something called Agent Orange, which is a chemical that they sprayed in the jungle. They also used something called napalm bombs, which were a gasoline-based bomb that set fire to the jungle.
During the Vietnam War, the army was called the ALVN.
In the Vietnam War, the Johnson administration had a man named Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense, and Dean Rusk was the Secretary of State.
William Westmoreland was the U.S. commander who wanted more troops in Vietnam.
The draft is where government selects people to go to Nam. You can avoid going to Nam by getting a college degree.
Students for Democratic Society is a group that said large government corporations and institutions were taking over America. The free speech movement grew out of clash between the students and the administration over free speech on campus. The administration criticized faceless and powerful businesses and government institutes.
Doves were those who opposed war, while hawks were those who wanted war in Vietnam.
An enemy attack in Vietnam, 2 assassinations, and a political convention made 1968 an explosive year. In 1968, beloved civil rights activist Martin Luther King was shot and killed in Memphis, Tennessee.
In 1968, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles in the Ambassador.
In the Battle of Saigon, the presidential palace was one of the first local forces to be under attack. They attacked from all sides of Saigon. One of the first battles of the Vietnam War was the Battle of Saigon, which is the capital of Vietnam.
In the 1968 election, the Republican candidate was Richard Nixon, and the Democratic was Hubert Humphrey.
National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger wanted to end U.S. armed forces in Vietnam, and so he came up with a process called Vietnamization, which was a gradual reduction of U.S. armed forces in Vietnam.
The Pentagon Papers were a 7,000-page document written for Secretary of Defense that said that showed the plans for going into the war into Vietnam under President Johnson, even though he said he would not. This had controversy because they said that he had no intentions into going in the war, and America was not aware of this.
Kent State University was a university that is known for the intense riot that happened in protest of the Vietnam War. Students created a riot that became so large that they eventually burnt down the ROTC. Several people were shot, some of which weren't even in the rally. This is just another example of how the Vietnam War created violence in the domestic front.
The War Powers Act was the act Congress passed to make the president tell Congress 48 hours before sending troops, and they could not send troops troops to other countries for longer than 9 months unless it was approved by Congress. This changed America's view on foreign policy.